Gurran, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney, and I'm co-convener of the Australasian Cities Research Network, or ACRN, which is hosting today's event. Before we go any further, I'd like to respectfully hand over to Dr. Virginia Marshall, who's going to welcome us today from her country.
Yuragu Marang, everyone. My name is Virginia, and I'm a Wiradjuri Nyimba woman. It's important to remember that the lands that you're situated on, that you live on, that you travel to are Aboriginal lands, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands of this country. We respect and we honour our elders and our communities that have really made this wonderful country what it is, and reinforced that culture and nature of our community is strong. And we also look forward to the younger generations and also the dedication and commitment that they make in our educational facilities and across Australia in various professions. But all of us know that Aboriginal land will always be Aboriginal land, and the waters and the sky above and what is below the earth is all from our creation spirit. So we are very thankful that you're safely here with us today and enjoying a wonderful time of debate and also sharing. Thank you. Madangulu.
Thank you so much, Virginia, for that very generous welcome. And I'd like to say, of course, that I'm coming to you from unceded Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and to their ongoing sovereignty and custodianship of this country. On this occasion of the first ACRN Speaking Out event, I also want to recognise that Aboriginal people have been talking and teaching and learning and sharing on this land for millennia. The ACRN was formed about a decade ago as a small scholarly society dedicated to the promotion of urban research through the biannual State of Australian Cities conferences, or the SOAC conferences, which began in the early 1990s. Aside from the tremendous work of the early career urban researchers, or ACRN, and many of you will have engaged with that network, the wider network has never actually had programming or a voice between the SOAC conferences. Last year, in the wake of the profound shocks from the 2019 bushfires in Australia to the global pandemic, as well, of course, as the watershed social movements, particularly around Black Lives Matter, the small ACRN volunteer committee, which I co-chair along with Paul McGinn, and which has members from across New Zealand and the Australian states, decided that the urban research community needs a stronger voice. And you can read our full statement about that on our website. But in short, our aim is to increase the impact of urban research, broadly defined, and the role of urban research in informing and catalysing real policy change, realising, of course, the links between urban policies and practices and questions of Indigenous sovereignty, environmental crises and social equity. We were also, of course, concerned to support our colleagues in the wake of attacks on higher education and research in public universities, while recognising that our own academy needs work. So we're starting this conversation today with inspiring women from across the career span and across the disciplines. They will share their thoughts and their research on these themes, as well as their perspectives on gender equity in the academy, in the professions, and in urban space, and really whatever they want to share with us, quite frankly. So I'm going to hand over now to Wendy Steele, who's Associate Professor in Sustainability and Urban Planning at RMIT University, and of course author of the recently published and widely acclaimed already book, Planning Wild Cities, and she's going to facilitate the conversation.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And look, welcome everyone. We, Nicole and I, have been extremely excited about bringing together this group of wonderful women, and we're really looking forward to hearing them share the research that they do, as well as provide some insights about the sorts of challenges and opportunities that they face as urban researchers from a range of different disciplines from across different career spans and different institutions. Following a feminist approach, this is twofold in focus. It's about the tale that they tell in their research, so the stories, the communities that they work with, but it's also equally about the teller, about these women in different contexts, in different age groups, with different backgrounds, in different contexts, really bringing together that reciprocal relationship between the tale and teller. Both are important. Some of the speakers will speak more to one than the other. We're interested in how that maps across the work that they've done. And you can see, for those of you that have read their different, brief biographies, and I'm not going to go into those in detail, I'll let the different speakers introduce themselves to some degree. But we're looking at women from Institute of Citizenship and Globalisation for Louise, Earth and Environmental Science for Dorina, the Australian Fenner School at ANU for Virginia, amongst other locations. I know, Virginia, you're co-located in a number of places. The School of Social Sciences and the Institute for Culture and Society for Emma, and the School of Public Health and Social Work for Lisa. So we're really looking at a very diverse interdisciplinary range of voices and the stories that they tell. So the agenda is that I'm going to invite each of the speakers in turn to share some thoughts, some remarks, some stories for 5 minutes. And then we will bring everyone together to collectively discuss some of the ideas that they've shared, and we invite questions from the audience in that section. And then I'll hand over to Nicole to finally wrap up this wonderful session, which is the first of the speaking out sessions, as Nicole mentioned, for the Australasian Cities Research Network. So Louise Johnson, it is my great privilege to invite you. I've followed your work for many years, and really, please take the floor and share with us some of your insights. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, and welcome everybody, and I also acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri land today. And I thought I'll just very briefly go over part of my story, which is actually over 40 years worth of battling in the academy. I was at Sydney University in the 1970s. But basically the feminist and the radical movements passed me by because I decided I better go and sit in Fisher Library and learn some stuff. But the feminist movement was impacting on the university in a whole host of ways, with things like general philosophy and general economics being confronted for their conservatism and for their kind of non-engagement with progressive politics. And I guess I became increasingly involved with progressive politics, but primarily as a kind of a fellow traveller, as a Marxist geographer while I was at Sydney University, which in terms of the awareness of gender, that happened primarily as a result of a couple of things. And this is a story about women in the academy, I suspect, that still goes on, in that a senior male professor at the time failed to recommend me for continuing position, unlike most of my male colleagues at the time. And another male geographer also failed to support my upgrade of a master's to a PhD. So there's been certain moments in my career that have been quite systemically blocked by some of my male colleagues in the discipline. And this, apart from arriving at Deakin and being pounced on as a potential member of a women's studies course team, basically meant that a feminist consciousness kind of exploded into a reality. And trying to connect that feminist consciousness, which is very much out of a political experience, a personal political experience, to geography, became one of the great quests of my intellectual life. So driven very much by that passion as well as by the curiosity, and then by increasing awareness of the way in which things like the domestic sphere, the inside of houses, the nature of suburbs, the nature of cities and shopping centres and workplaces were variously structured in a way to systematically disadvantage women. And so my PhD was on the textile industry and the changing sexual division of labour as the industry collapsed over the 1980s. And the first piece of work I actually did was in 1985. I realised in Australia it was about the possibility of feminist geography in Australia. So I guess I've been sort of coming rather late to this discourse, but also hopefully in a way that's been constructive in terms of intervening into the discipline of geography. I've done a lot of head counts of how many women there are, where they are, how senior they are, the treatment that they've had. And it's not, of course, a great story, but we're getting there. It's just like all those other glacial social movements for gender equity around income and so on, that it's far too slow and we've got a long way to go. So keep being stroppy gals is the message. A lot of those thoughts were manifested or came together, I guess, in the book that I did called Placebound, which is around Australian feminist geographies, where I brought that stuff together. Very much coming out of my experience of actually being rung up at Deakin, feeling very grumpy one day about something, from the University of Waikato, who said, "We want a feminist geographer." And I thought they were joking because it didn't exist back then in 1988. So they hired me to kind of teach this new thing called feminist geography, and it was very much hitching my wagon to that agenda that I proceeded down that path. And it was in that context that I also started looking at suburban developments, and in particular the piece that some of you may have read all around looking at some master plan communities in outer suburban Melbourne, and basically making an argument that developers as well as planners as well as others basically think they're going to solve the problems of the suburbs and create a market edge by doing clever things, like in this case creating a thing called controlled diversity, which I thought was a really interesting idea in terms of maybe a sensitivity to social and economic difference, that basically was about different sized buildings on different sized lots to basically maximise yield and to kind of get a market edge and to basically be a property developer, which, you know, in no great surprise there. But I guess the message, looking back over that piece, and I was thinking, oh my God, I wrote this back in 90 something or other. It's kind of out of date. And I was thinking, what would I keep in that? And of course, I'm a bit embarrassed by my sort of sneering at the raising of urban densities out in the suburbs, and certainly a bit anxious about some of the comments that I made, but also embarrassed by the fact that I didn't do a much tougher sort of analysis of the place of women in these developments, and basically the pretense of, in this case, Delphin, to present to suburban occupiers, of course, women who are basically stuck there most of the day at the time that I was interviewing, and I was interviewing with a whole group of others as well, that the idea that the social isolation, the various issues that women faced in the suburbs could be basically addressed by good urban design, when basically women wanted safety, they wanted jobs, they wanted mobility, they wanted a whole lot of other things, but basically nobody had actually asked them what they wanted and needed, and they certainly weren't planning or addressing those needs. So the kind of oracles of Delphin were basically incredibly ill-informed and blundering away out there, making lots of money and creating environments that I guess now we somewhat despair about. But also a large number of people, including the women who live there, made into communities, made into something special, made into something important. And I'm still somebody who defends the suburbs, and I'm now very interested in what the COVID impact has been on the changing dynamics of suburban environments, because much to my amazement, they've been rediscovered in a really positive way as people flee the inner city. So there's been these huge shifts that I think we're seeing here, and my next project, I think amongst many, will be to actually revisit the suburbs and to see what's going on out there now under a post-COVID environment. And I guess that's 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Louise. Thank you very much. And, you know, what a great way to start the discussion with an interweaving of the tale and the teller. And also one of Nicole's ideas about this seminar series, which I really really like is that the papers and the references that the speakers are referring to are linked to the seminar and can also be found on the ACRN website. So if you're interested in reading more about Louise's paper, Women in Suburban Housing Development, noting, as Louise did, it was in 1997 that it was written, and she would rewrite some aspects of that, then please refer to that particular article. I'm now going to invite Virginia to share with us some insights from her work. Thanks very much, Virginia.
Thanks very much. Well, that's just a force to come after you, Louise. That was really wonderful. Well, much like you, when I started university, I did 3 concurrent degrees, and I had 4 children. I was coming out of domestic violence many years later, and I think that my experience of university was really difficult and pretty traumatic as well. But you know, I didn't have any ideas. I guess I was naive in the fact that isn't that what you do? You just take all the different degrees and do them. So you can see that that's a possibility of getting out of domestic violence. So I think that naivety just allowed me to go and work really hard and value the scholarly work that I really love sharing. Like Wendy, you've given this opportunity to us really to talk about these things. And I think it's great because when you're actually going through the rigours of being a student, I see that today with other students that I'm supervising down in Fenner and RegNet at ANU, that, you know, for a lot of students, they really don't get the opportunity to reflect on scholarly issues and human issues. And I think that was the real difficulty on one side, but on the other side, there was an enlightenment for people with COVID on our doorsteps, because people actually had to reassess their relationships, reassess their workspace. Workspaces were reassessing our communities, but I think that was also really important for us to value that time and that space of being at home, because I found that a lot of the times I'd be out and about doing research in rural and remote communities, but again, you know, looking for that space to really write valuable work, like you said, Louise, that's something that's really going to get people understanding that what they're actually living in, whether it's the suburbs or an urban environment, that, you know, for us as Indigenous peoples, it's an Indigenous space. You know, the first thing that people do when they come to where I live is that they set up fences. They change the native plants into agapanthus and, you know, leylandis and all these other really nasty trees. So all trees aren't great trees. So, you know, that's really interesting that, you know, they're still colonising us and also our spaces, and a lot of communities, especially, you know, from Canberra up north to Sydney, they're not really open to having Aboriginal flags on people's properties. And yeah, I think that lack of celebration is really something that we still struggle with. And I think what we still struggle with is really engaging with Indigenous history and identity, and not the identity that people have generally been taught at school. And that's one thing that I see lacking considerably in education and universities, that we're not really talking to people with lived experience and talking with people with lived experience. And that means that lived experience from an Indigenous perspective is actually being taught by an Indigenous person. And it's much like climate change. Climate change has been whipping up a storm for many years, and I keep on being involved in this and being asked to be on panels internationally, etc. And, you know, one thing that I was asked is that if Aboriginal peoples aren't sitting down at the table, what should we do? You know, if they're not engaged, if people aren't engaging with communities. And I guess my response was just walk out, because it's a position that you have to take, that if people aren't going to be incorporated and listened to, that it's really not a safe space. And I think that people with disability and people with mental health understand this issue completely, if you don't feel that you're actually a participating citizen of this country. So I think that a lot to do with sustainability, and this goes back to a panel that I was on with climate change. There are real issues in urban Australia that a lot of our communities' identity has been displaced by Western plants, Western planning, buildings, air quality or lack of air quality, lack of safe spaces for Indigenous people, where you often walk through Sydney or Brisbane and it doesn't feel very inclusive, because when you see communities on the sides of the road or in rural, remote community areas, they're not sitting in a safe place where they can share without being observed by the police, without being observed by people walking past them in suburban areas. So that came across in these issues that we're exploring today, that, you know, there isn't that safety. And we believe that when we see people, you know, in that situation of sharing with community, that, you know, is alcohol included or is there substance abuse, that people are actually sitting down and sharing. But we wouldn't see that differently if we were sitting at a coffee lounge. So I think that all of the issues that I deal with, even in the water space, in my water research, in my research into intellectual property of Indigenous communities and how that fares in that space too, in that Australian space of the doctrine of discovery, which is impeding Aboriginal people's identity, and also the language that we use. You know, Aboriginal people were here. You know, I'm on Darawal country, which is unceded country, and thank you for citing that too, Louise. That, you know, we have to remember that language that we're using is really going to impede our feeling of being valued, but it also means that how we write, if it's in past tense, it also really deeply hurts us. So I think that, you know, it's not only just building greater cities and being aware that climate change is having a huge impact, because we're not really up there leading with other countries, and we're certainly seeing that with the Biden summit and what's to come for COP26. So, you know, I think that we need to really have that Indigenous voice everywhere and anywhere, not only on our campuses, not only in our writings, but where we live. We really need to engage and ask, well, you know, if I don't see Aboriginal people, you know, why don't I? Or if our communities, our shire councils don't engage with Aboriginal people, don't seek to protect Aboriginal heritage, then why don't they? So I think that we need to really step up to the challenges. And we know that there's a lot of work to do in a lot of different spaces, but I think the honouring of Indigenous peoples has to come first and foremost, not only at work, but at home. And I think that that will make a much more of a community spirit, because Black Lives Matters has really raised the bar that all of our work and our reports in Australia hasn't really got through to the Australian public, of how serious these issues here are, and how serious racism is in Australia. And it can be very nuanced. And I think that that's what we need to look at, is trying to raise the bar on expectations which should be higher than they were 20 or 40 years ago. I think we need to understand how to deal with that in our working space, but also in the inclusivity that we have in our urban areas, our rural and remote areas, because I'm seeing that that's still very much 1950s in some of the areas of Queensland and Western Australia and Northern Territory. It's not really a safe space for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, but it can be better if we actually look at how we're going to develop and engage and consult with Aboriginal peoples in where we live. I think that's the first and foremost, and then tackle our workspace after that. So, you know, that's been a really big emphasis for me of water security for Indigenous peoples, because we basically don't have anything in the national blueprint at all, and we don't have any protection for intellectual property of Indigenous peoples. And I think that sitting on the ethics committee at ANU has really brought that home to me, that, you know, we've got a lot of work to do there, and a lot of the research that we do, sometimes we don't even think of engaging with Aboriginal people. We don't think about paying Aboriginal people, but we seek to have the information, and often we don't go back to actually feed back to Aboriginal communities. So I think that, you know, that ethics space is something that I'd love to see throughout Australia stepping up as well. that we can really be inclusive, but we can be respectful. And I think that's one of the ideas that I had when I did the proposal for Yinyamarra conversation series at the Australian Studies Institute in ANU. And the first interview I had was with Lydia Thorpe. And it was fantastic because, you know, for that 15 minutes, it was a really wonderful space to explore, you know, Indigenous issues and her lived experience. She left at school at 14, I left school at 16. So there was a lot of sharing and caring. And I think that that's what we need to do academically. I think we need to have that opportunity to engage more, and especially in the space for women. I think Louise is absolutely right. You know, if you look around yourself, how many people are Indigenous, you know, within your academies, and how many people are senior women who are Indigenous in your academies. So I think that that's really important too, is really having that shared feeling of scholarly work, but also just to create a better scholarly environment. Thank you.
I'm on mute.
Yeah, I thought so.
The old doesn't matter how long you do Zooming for it, Susan.
I know, me too, me too.
Virginia, that was
thank you, Wendy.
Very moving and powerful, and that kind of moving from Louise's explosion of the feminist consciousness into reality to sharing and caring as a collective community, and the significance and importance of Indigenous voices and sovereignty. Thanks, Virginia.
Thanks, Wendy.
I'm going to hand over to Lisa Stafford now. Lisa, please share with us your always thoughtful comments on the work that you've been doing.
Many thanks, Wendy, and thanks to the amazing speakers so far. And look, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Lutruwita, Tasmania, the unceded Aboriginal lands and seas and waterway of the Power people. So look, today's focus, I'm going to be talking about is the body space politics that exists between gender and disability intersection. But I want to acknowledge the wonderful women I've also co-written with on this work, Kirsty Volz and Claudia Baldwin, both amazing women in their own rights. So my passion for planning inclusive communities and my advocacy against social and spatial injustice has been a culmination about 18 years from professional practice and also my scholarly work. But this is also it's also deeply personal for me. It's personal because as a disabled, chronically ill woman, my body's and ways of moving in space, either walking with a walking stick or a power wheelchair, is a constant reminder that the world is not planned and designed for people like me. This is conveyed from symbolism, materiality, and physical social encounters, from paternalistic pitying looking, physical denied access nearly everywhere, extreme public transport experiences, and being outrightly asked what's wrong with you, or even my wheelchair, which is part of me, becoming the public armrest for someone waiting in line. These are just the past few weeks. But I acknowledge I'm in a very privileged position. Many disabled people, and I use this term to recognize that we are disabled by society, not through our impairments, struggle to get through the day-to-day and experience the everyday spaces we take for granted. Due to the structural and systemic oppression that strips dignity, choice, while government austerity measures continually portray us as burdened slackers and cheaters. So what does this have to do with body space politics? Well, space is never neutral, and our planning and design practice isn't either. Exclusion is by design. Our cities, communities, parks, and policies don't just happen, they're socially created, but often done without thinking about diversity and who are we planning for. So how and why does this happen? When we foreground the body in design, it helps to expose and illustrate just how spatial injustice unfolds for diverse bodies. By doing this, we soon discover that for centuries, society and design have operated from a normative view of what constitutes a supposedly standard body. The male, able, young, cis body that has been upheld and unquestioned as the reference point for planning and design for a long time coming. Yet few of us would actually ever meet the standard. Now this unrepresentative body form has also been facilitated by the 20th century proliferation of documenting the body in terms of metrics or anthropometric studies. So most common is Ernest Newford. So if you're in the architect's data book, that was created in 1936, but still was printed in 2012. Now this body, the male body, which it's based on, is a series of diagrams, plans, and sections and elevations that which somehow represents how a body stands, sits, and walks. Now this body continues to be the fundamental basis for understanding and designing and planning our objects, our furniture, our buildings and cities today. Even the planning, how do we plan our walkable neighbourhoods? Our article clearly exposes planning for who in that regard. The female body only turned up in about the 1950s when Henry Dreyfus appeared, Josephine appeared. Even a wheelchair has turned up in the body metric space, and because of access and laws emerged in about the 1990s, but even then it's still a male body and a male manual chair. That's the dominant reference point. So the body as a metric subjugates diverse bodies, and some more than others. But it also neglects the fundamental fact that our bodies are complex, they're moving, they're variable, they're three-dimensional beings that inhabit space. Our being in the world is through our body. The other profound way disabled bodies are othered in the built environment is by an unchecked and unrecognized prejudice of ableism. It is based on this long-held belief that we've been holding up for a long time, and unfortunately one's personhood and subsequent value is actually attributed only to those who fit that bodily configuration. Power and privilege is actually attributed to only those. And also ableism is further reinforced through the medical discourse of deficits and non-normative bodies like mine, and question and problematize our diverse ways in which we move, think, speak, and act. These unchecked ways of seeing our body space allows for spatial injustice and the human rights violations against disabled people to preserve unchecked. And thinking about justice spatially helps us also to understand, to address the interconnectedness of social oppressions. So who you are and where you live shouldn't determine whether you live and thrive. And that's a really profound thing. And I think as a profession, we can no longer think about or use the excuse that this is just how it's done. We are setting the futures of our societies through our policies, our plans, our designs. So it's our responsibility as researchers, policymakers, planners and designers to actually question who are we planning for if we want to create a spatial justice world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Thank you. I mean, wow, Louise, Virginia, Lisa, this is some powerful work that we're hearing on this Wednesday today, and something to think through and discuss collectively as we move forward. Lisa's got 2 articles that are linked to this seminar: Diverse Body Space Politics Towards a Critique of Social Injustice of Built Environments, and Planning Walkable Neighbourhoods, Are We Overlooking Diversity, Inabilities and Ages? And she's co-authored those with the colleagues that she mentioned. So thanks so much, Lisa. I'm going to turn now to Emma Power. Emma Power. Yeah, Emma, I heard speak at a Cities of Care conference that Alan, Libby and I had organised in Melbourne some years back, and her work has just flourished in this space of infrastructures of care. And I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak about that, Emma, or whatever else it is that you choose to share with us today.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Nicole. And thanks to this panel of amazing women, many of whom have inspired my work and thinking at various points in time. It's an honour to speak after and with you all. So, I mean, I'm speaking today from the unceded lands of the Gundungurra people in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, and I work on the lands of the Barramatical people, the Darug Nation in Western Sydney. And I'd like to recognise the traditional owners of that land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. These places that I live in and work in, like many others around the world, in the last 24 months have been places of heatwave, of bushfire, of flood, of pandemic, and they're also places of growing social difference. And I think we're challenged by these places and in this moment to recognise our interconnection with country, both in terms of our impact and dependence. And I think these events are affecting us all in what are really profoundly unequal ways. They're also confronting us to see the ways that we're held together across lines of difference. the ways that inequality is affecting us in new ways, I think has become more apparent than ever in the last 12 months. And for me, care is an ethic that can help us to understand these connections, and it can also motivate our work towards more equitable, fair and caring connections. And so I wanted to take the opportunity today to think about the place of care within our cities as an ethic and a practice that is central to cities, and to think about what it might mean to centre care in the ways that we both understand and seek to transform these urban places that we live in and make. And in my work, I build from Fisher and Tronto's understanding of care as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. It's a definition that recognises the necessity of care as a practice that we simply can't survive without. And Maria Puig-de-la-Bellacasa has said, you know, care is something that one might reject in a situation, but you can't reject it absolutely without disappearing. And I think it's also a definition that recognises the transformative potential of care that helps us and challenges us to repair our world so that we don't just survive in them, but that we can actually flourish and live well in them. And I thought I'd talk a little bit today about a paper that Miriam Williams and I wrote, where we started to think about what care might mean in cities, and we set out a platform for thinking through this. So we argue first that care challenges urban thinkers and practitioners to recognise the necessity of care and to consider the care needs that sustain life. So this means thinking beyond the intimate practices and labours of care, though these are important, to also attend to the webs of relations that actually sustain life, whether that's access to sufficient quality food, affordable, appropriate housing, or just more broadly, the economic conditions that might sustain well-being. These are the relations that we think make all life and care possible, but which we see are increasingly challenged by growing social difference, environmental change, and so on. And so in expanding beyond intimate care, we argue in our work the need to examine the urban conditions and infrastructures that actually sustain and reproduce care. A second provocation that we offer is to attend to the ways that care is practiced and navigated and negotiated at the urban scale. So not just within singular places like homes or healthcare settings, but actually within and across cities. And this is because we think urban residents are living across cities. We live our lives across cities, and our everyday life requires that we navigate urban systems. And the systems and relations that we encounter when we do this are actually generative of our capacity to care. So the nature of cities, of urban access and restructuring, the mobilities and immobilities that organise urban life are all part of this picture. As cities are reworked through new economic and labour practices, so too are the lives that we live across those cities. And so we might look, for instance, at the growing levels of contract and casual work and how these fracture standard working hours with implications for not only housing, but also for domestic care. And so I think care is an ethic that really challenges us to see these connections. And a third provocation that we offer is the need to expand the scope of what we understand as care within cities. So care, I believe, is an ethic that can inform all of the work that we do. It certainly informs my research. And understanding care in this way allows us to ask different questions about the way that care flows through cities in the everyday sites, places and relations that do constitute the urban. So these flows can be material or immaterial. They can be public or private, as care is practiced and performed through policies, processes, materials, buildings, interpersonal relationships and more. And so this is to argue that care has the potential to be present in all urban spaces and places, and that it has the potential to be transformative in all of these settings. So we want to recognise the care practices and ethics that shape and inform systems of social and economic and political organisations within within cities, and ask, for instance, how urban design or the organisation of markets or practices of urban governance, including the work of urban planners and policymakers, might be understood to care and through this to support the flourishing of life. And so at the heart of these projects, what we're really envisioning is a world of more caring cities. We suggest that care is a really important urban tool and ethic. It's one that offers an alternative political imaginary that might reorder the way that we think about our housing systems and our urban systems. And so we really challenge urbanists to think about the caring work and caring capacity of cities, to ask about the caring work that's performed through urban planning and through urban design, and to ask of any city, is this a city that cares? That's my contribution.
Wow, we're just building this momentum and this collective solidarity. Thanks so much, Emma, for sharing with us your collective collegial image of an alternative politics, a different way of thinking through the ethics that we need to underpin the work that we do and the cities that we live in. And I'm sure we'll hear more of that across the panel as we come to the final discussion. But last but certainly not least, Dorina, thanks so much for being the final speaker and sharing with us your vision and some of the work from your new book, which is forthcoming, Trophy Cities, a feminist perspective on new capitals, to take us home with the final remarks. Thanks, Dorina.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thanks for having me. I join you from Brisbane. I live in a suburb called West End. The Aboriginal name of my suburb is Kurilpa, actually. And I work at the University of Queensland, and I'll talk to you about my forthcoming book, which offers a feminist perspective on new purpose-built, master-planned capital cities. I had a variety of reasons for picking the topic. For one thing, I was born and raised myself in a new capital city, Tirana, Albania. That's where I'm from originally. That was created in the early 20th century when Albania gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. I'm also a naturalized US citizen, and the US, of course, has another purpose-built capital city, Washington, D.C. I didn't include neither of those two in the book because Tirana, my hometown, I've written about extensively in a lot of my early articles. I've criticized it, but that doesn't mean I don't love it. And DC I didn't include because it's not a 20th century capital city. My perspective is that all those cities have always been built under patriarchal regimes. In the 20th century, there was this extra added arrogance hubris that planners sort of adopted thanks to technology, and the idea that society could now be engineered the way factory production could be engineered. So can I share one slide to show the book cover? This is what it will look like. So what I've done, instead of taking the traditional route of devoting one chapter to each case study, I've structured the book by theme. The case studies include the capital of Australia, Canberra. I did include that one. And then I included Chandigarh in India, which is not national capital, but it is an important state capital. I included Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. I included Astana, now called Nur Sultan, that's the capital of Kazakhstan. I included Naypyidaw, the capital of Myanmar, and I was able to do the research before things in Myanmar deteriorated, the political situation now, that research there is impossible. And a final one is Sejong, the capital of South Korea, which is an administrative capital. It shares capital duties with Seoul, Korea's traditional capital. So my big argument in the book is that all these new capitals embody the patriarchy that governs the respective polities in those countries. And because of that, any urban problems have been magnified. So now there have been other writings that have connected urban planning and urbanism to the feminist movement, but I go beyond that in the book, and I also link feminism and other important notions that connect to urban planning, such as the state, the nation, especially post-colonial nation building, religion, the economy, and even nature. I feel that all these entities have been treated in patriarchal terms as things to be dominated as opposed to things to work with. And that has come to the detriment of women, but also other disadvantaged groups. And I don't talk just about women in the book, because I feel contemporary feminism needs to be intersectional and consider other groups as well. It's not the second wave feminism of white elite women anymore, or it shouldn't be. So I talk about the historical processes, how these new capital cities came to be. I talk about the spatial aspects of new capitals. I talk about the symbolic manifestations of new capitals. And finally, I also treat new capitals as ordinary cities, just daily cities, not spaces of power representation. And one big reason I sort of centered in this topic was my travels around the world had made me see and experience some new capitals in person before I wrote the book. And I felt that there were just so many failures in these cities. And I thought to myself, why should this be? I mean, this is a unique opportunity for planners. Planning a new city, it's not a project that comes all the time. It's a once in a lifetime commission. And yet it was just, all the cities that I saw were rife with social inequalities, ethnic inequalities, and they weren't very, very well planned either. And so I got to thinking, well, where are the failures more evident? And I felt that there wasn't much difference in democratic versus authoritarian regimes, in post-colonial nations versus places that had long been independent, or places with a socialist legacy versus capitalist, or in countries that had a Black majority versus a white majority versus an Asian majority, poorer countries versus wealthier countries. And so then I decided, well, patriarchy is the thread that connects these places. That's sort of the thread that runs across and it's been a mainstay. What can I say to conclude? I hope that when you read the book, you find it thought-provoking, and I hope it offers a fresh perspective, something that hasn't been said before.
Thank you so much, Dorina. Perhaps if you could unshare your slide and we might bring the panel back. Congratulations on your forthcoming book. We'll all look forward to reading that and engaging with it in a scholarly and also in a collegial way. Look, thank you to everyone in the panel. It reminded me of some of the work by Toni Morrison, who's written about the idea of rememory, of not taking as a given the way that history has been narrated for us, but actually to draw on personal and political context to rememorize the given situations, and then use that as a basis for building and reconstructing alternative future imaginaries and contemporary context. So a thread that came through, I think, all of the speakers, but which Ash Alam has asked in his question, it's posed to Emma, but I might open it up to the whole panel. And it's really about how we can mobilise care, maybe an ethic of care, or sharing and caring, as Virginia mentioned, all the other ways that people infused and wove this through their different provocations. How can care be mobilised as a political tool within our contemporary context and times? So I might start with Emma, given that it was posed to you specifically, but I would like to open this up to everyone because I think it does touch on elements of what everyone had to say. So thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Ash, for the great question. I think that what CARE can challenge planners to do in their practice is to think about what the purpose and value of cities and housing is, and it can recenter different sorts of questions. I mean, at the moment, there's a kind of economically rational individual human who's supposed to take responsibility for their own needs. And I think that that what planners and any other urban practitioner can do if they want to centre care in their practice is start to think about how the particular space that they're working in, whether it's housing policy or urban design, how does it shape the capacity of people to care, to meet those needs that that sustain life and sustain survival. And I think talking about this is really powerful. I did a presentation a few months ago across a few state government departments for people involved in the housing space. And one of the conversations that we had is about housing as an infrastructure of care, and how if we start to use that language, and if we start to use it at barbecues on the weekends, if we start to use it at work, if we start to use it in meetings and policy conversations, that maybe we can start to shift away from that very economistic, financialised understanding of housing that we have at the moment. So I think using the language and starting to plant the seeds of those ideas is one tool and one way that we can go about doing this.
Thanks so much, Emma. Would anyone else like to follow on from that, or take it into a different line of flight?
Look, I'll just have a quick word. I think, look, that's a really good point about caring, but I think it even goes deeper than that. And you can read many Indigenous authors across the world. And I think one thing that we also always talk about is that we're misrepresented in so many areas, as Dorina's really pointed out. It's not only the patriarchy, but it's very often, you know, Western women in those early days that were oppressing us as well. And that's why many Aboriginal women didn't participate in feminism, because they couldn't see the point, because there weren't people to relate to. There weren't Indigenous feminists until much later in the 80s, mid 70s and 80s. So I think it's really important for, especially in Australia, post-COVID, that we really get a deeper relationship and an understanding about the diversity of Indigenous peoples in Australia. And I think what we've got to do is take away those stereotypes. And Lisa spoke about, you know, the stereotypes that able people have. Well, you know, as Indigenous people, we suffer those all the time. I'm listening to, you know, the terrible tragedy in India, and people not being allowed back to Australia who are Australian citizens and permanent residents. And I think that we have to look at those issues and say, well, Aboriginal people, not long ago in the High Court of Australia, there was a whole discussion by the High Court whether Aboriginal people who are Aboriginal heritage and recognised by Aboriginal people in Australia in their own community could actually come back to Australia because they'd lived in and were born in different areas of the world, one in Papua New Guinea and also one in New Zealand. So, you know, those sort of discussions at the High Court are talking about our identity, you know, if we should actually be allowed to come back to Aboriginal Australia. I think that's really, you know, the essence of, if we're going to live in cities, we've got to really have a deeper relationship and understanding and humanity with difference. You know, if we don't really have that humanity and difference, it really isn't going to work, whichever theoretical foundation we begin with. So I think that's what I'd like to see, is more humanity. And that comes in our work and in our place where we live. And especially not only in the Indigenous space, but in what all of us have been talking about today.
Thanks very much, Virginia.
Thanks, Wendy.
Did Lisa, Louise or Dorina, would you like to follow on from that? Yeah, to humanity and an ethic of care. It's interesting the links between them, as well as what might make them distinctive. Jago has just asked a question about how the panelists see spaces. This actually picks up on a comment that Libby Porter made earlier about how appreciative she is that there's spaces like this opening up for discussions and ideas like this in all of its different forms. And Jago's more specific question is how, you know, a network like the Australasian Cities Research Network could support and promote further these conversations in a genuine and, you know, sincere sense, and not just lip service that we then move on to the next topic. Did any of the panelists have any thoughts about that? Lisa, in the work that you articulated so evocatively, how do you go about creating those spaces of change? How do you go about trying to shift the narrative practices?
I think it's based on what, Virginia beautifully put before, that humanity and that acceptance of diversity, which, if you think about it, we are all diverse. That's one, yes, we're human, but we're so diverse. Not, one of us are exactly the same. And, but we shy away from it. And, which is, and have done for a very long time, and that deep-seated stigma and racism and ableism, these, we just haven't confronted them. And I think one of the things we do, and this is always confronting, but it has to be done in some ways that we do uncheck it, because it just goes by tacitly. And while we may not actively engage in it, I mean, some actively do, but I think until we actually confront it and talk about it and actually challenge how we actually view and respect diversity in this country, and particularly how that plays out in our planning and geography sense, it's going to be challenging. So that's one of the things I always talk about is the agenda setting. Like, first thing, let's just embrace human diversity, value it and celebrate it, and be kind to it. That's, I think that's a really important starting point.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lisa. Livy Porter has just also said, how can we keep making this kind of space and making it work for us? And that, there's been so much talk of exclusion, marginalisation. The system's clearly not working, it's broken. How do we not just get bogged down in that and keep making safe spaces? And Alexa Gow also says that she's appreciative of powerful, safe spaces. And the role of the panelists as mentors to other urban researchers, other women in the academy, on so many different levels. There are insights to and gifts to take away. And I just noting the time, I would like to acknowledge the work of Nicole Gurran in creating these kind of spaces. It was Nicole and Crystal Legacy that first created the Special Women's Panel at the State of Australian Cities. That's an initiative that just is building in success, where it profiles women for women, talking about successes, talking about challenges, and sharing that space at the State of Australian Cities conference. So, thank you to Nicole and Crystal for getting that mobilised. But also, this was Nicole's idea to get this seminar series going, and this is just the first iteration of that. So, look, I might hand over back to Nicole, who is actually stepping down from her convener role in the Australasian Cities Network, and just to share again my appreciation, Nicole, for everything you've done to create spaces like this, and to thank all of our speakers. This is obviously an impoverishedly short amount of time to engage appropriately with everything you have to say, but it's a start. So Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, it is the start, and that's exactly why I'm stepping down. The door is open, and all of the people who've spoken here and who are listening, that door is open for you to come in, and I'm going to be listening and watching and, and cheering and amplifying. But I want to say two things. And the first is that our speakers today did something extremely generous, and that is they used their personal experiences, all of them, to highlight really, really awkward, difficult things that a lot of us actually are much more comfortable in turning away from. And Lisa and Virginia, I think in particular, made that point, but Louise in talking about the systemic blockages, and Emma talking about the possibilities that that we could take up also, I think highlights that. But really, it's the generosity of our speakers in forcing us, in using their own personal experience and putting that on the table as a basis for us to realise that we really do need to actually have difficult and ongoing conversations. And so thank you, and thank you for the comments from our attendees as well, who've really appreciated that. And so this is a conversation that we are beginning. And with that, can I ask you to now go and track down the readings? There's a curated reading list it's a fantastic, even though our speakers have been very modest about their contributions, they are fantastic contributions, and we will continue to share more contributions like this through the ACRN website and series. And there's another speaking out series that will be coming to us from New Zealand very, very soon. So I think that's all that's to be said. Thank you so much, Wendy, for your great sharing, and thank you to all of our speakers.